All right. So, welcome everyone. So, the topic for tonight is going to be ethics or the non-aggression principle, and the two debaters are going to be Killergummybear and Tony. And we're going to begin with opening statements for about 6 minutes, open discussion for 40 minutes, closing statements 6 minutes, and then Q&A depending on how many people request up to do Q&A. Did you guys decide on who wants to go first, or should I do a coin flip?
I'm fine with a coin flip. I came here to discuss argumentation ethics specifically.
Yeah, we both agreed on that, or all three of us
Perfect.
agreed on that. All right.
Okay.
Heads or tails?
It's
All right.
Tails.
If it lands on heads, Killer Gummy Bear goes first.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It landed on tails, so I guess Tony gets to go first. So Tony,
Alright.
you're gonna be arguing against the non-aggression principle and argumentation ethics. Killer Gummy Bear will be arguing in favor of it.
Alright.
All right. You may start. Your timer will begin whenever you begin speaking.
Okay, I'm gonna be sharing my screen in case anybody wants to read what I'm reading here. NAP argumentation ethics is the idea that the act of engaging in the process of argumentation presupposes the non-aggression principle as a principle universal across all circumstances, due to the act in engaging in argumentation requiring non-aggression by all parties for rational deliberation. Non-aggression here is defined, or at least I'm going to define it here, and you can talk about this after, is defined as the idea that acts constituting aggression upon a peaceful party are illegitimate, where aggression means the use of physical force or violation of loosely voluntary consent via fraud, where loosely voluntary means any exchange where nobody is being forced to do anything through violence, and is informed in what they are agreeing to. The problem of NAP argumentation ethics is 1. It wrongly assumes that by appealing to some norm by engaging in the argumentation process, you are necessarily assuming that norm universally in all circumstances. This is not true. I don't think this is true. It also, number 2, it assumes arguments necessarily only apply to the full NAP in a way that mistakes what arguments are even meant to be. The first problem here is that by engaging in some process, you agree to follow the norms of the process. Let us assume rational deliberation, through argumentation, requires the NAP. Even if this was the case, following the norms in the context of some process does not mean those norms apply in any other context. If you play a game like Minecraft and you do not cheat, that cheating need not apply to any other game or context. You could easily say, I never cheat or hack in Minecraft, and then cheat at other games, and you would not be inconsistent. The same applies to argumentation, and in this sense, NAP argumentation ethics becomes a mere category error between the non-normative process of defending an argument and the normative idea of a universal rule. There is much more going on here, though, because this category error relies on the process of defending an argument being non-normative, in the sense that the behavior within the process cannot be extrapolated into anything universal. There is a sense in which it actually can, but that sense is fundamentally opposed to the NAP. To explain what I mean, imagine the persuasive argument, defined here as any argument that tries to support a conclusion along the lines of, therefore, you ought to believe X, where X is some claim. Any argument worth any salt should be able to convince you of some belief, for if it did not, you could simply ignore it, and there would be no rational obligation or rational ought to pay mind to the argument. Any argument that functions like this, any persuasive argument, needs to appeal to normative rationalism to make sense, not as a key part of the process of arguing, but as a premise of the argument itself. For any persuasive argument X, this argument is only valid if it appeals to general normative rationalism, the idea that you ought to do that which is rational, as a premise of the argument itself. This can be proven via deduction. I can show that deductive process later, but for now I'm just going to continue. What this means is any argument that tries to convince you of some belief must appeal to the idea that you ought to act rationally, and also believe rationally, for that matter. To acquire this, though, creates two problems for the NAP. The first is that general normative rationalism, taken as an assumption, assuming applying rationalism in only specific circumstances is inconsistent, and also since any argument ought to be rational and not irrational, any interaction between parties, be that people or groups, should be rational too, and not conflict with rational deliberation. This is due to the truth-seeking nature of such deliberation. If instead one party transgresses upon another, having their interests given priority in a way that may be irrational and present an illogical outcome, this is especially contradictory with the value of rational deliberation. To be clearer, for someone to force someone else to do something, whether that force is through violence, or otherwise aggression, or non-violent coercion, or threats of some negative consequence, speaking broadly, can prevent open debate. Two rational people from different places should be able to interact rationally without fear. If one person goes insane and kills the other, that is clearly conflicting with rational dealings. If one person tries to trick the other for some scam, that is clearly conflicting with rational dealings. Everybody agrees with this, but if one person takes advantage of another for their own gain, where the other is functionally forced to do their bidding, that also conflicts with rational dealings. Coercion means pressuring someone to act against their own interests by undermining their ability to make a free choice through the threat of consequences. This is obviously contradictory with interests as a value, and it is also conflicting with the norms required for rational argumentation and cooperation, as coercion does not track truth, and in fact undermines it by functioning more similarly to might makes right behavior. Imagine trying to make an argument that God does not exist, or that God does exist, in a society where the vast majority of people believe the exact opposite of whatever conclusion you are arguing for, and will ostracize you, as well as discriminate against you of their own volition, if your argument is too explicit or offensive. There is no use of force or threat of force, yet even in such a scenario, very clearly this non-violent coercion, as I'm using the word coercion
10,
here,
10-second warning.
is contradictory and actively discourages rational and truth-seeking deliberation. I can stop here. That's fine.
Okay.
There's only
Yeah.
one more section here.
It's like on the mark. All right, Gummy
Yeah.
Bear, you will have same time, 6 minutes for your opening statement.
Okay. I'm likely going to be spending a lot less time for my introduction since it's a lot shorter.
Okay, that's fine. You can, whenever you start with it, I'll start the timer.
I can't seem for some reason be able to share my screen, so I'll just read it out.
Okay.
Okay. First, I'll use the Oxford definition, which is the action of or process of reasoning systematically in support of an idea, action, or theory. This is the definition of argumentation. This can be used in many different areas like trade, bartering, and social interaction, and law. Argumentation presupposes a few social norms in order for argumentation to occur. In this debate, I will be focusing on non-aggression. If aggression is used, then argumentation has been disrupted and thus can no longer continue, and any active argumentation presupposes us to be able to argue. To say otherwise, this rejects the principles of argumentation, of which you are partaking by discussing with me. As non-aggression is a norm that must be presupposed in order for argumentation to occur, we can extrapolate this further. For example, since trade requires argumentation to occur and argumentation requires non-aggression, then no party should use force when trade occurs. E.g., one side doesn't steal the means of production, nor the other uses force to enslave the other. Rejection of such norms also means rejection of argumentation. So a criminal who acts criminally commits aggression and thus rejects argumentation while committing that act. They may appeal to those norms by returning any stolen property or handing themselves in for equivalent punishments, but until this is done, they remain antithetical to societal norms in argumentation. Finally, argumentation ethics does not apply to situations outside of argumentation and the NAP as well. They are normative rules required for social interaction and do not apply to individual actions that do not affect other parties directly. That would be all.
All right. If that's your opening statement, the next segment will be open discussion for the next 40 minutes. So whichever one of you wants to kick it off, you can go ahead.
Okay, sure. What was your reason to say? Wait, so what is your stance on whether the NAP applies to all social interaction. Like, what was your reason for that again?
Because the
Like-
definition of argumentation includes all forms of social interaction between two or more parties, making it so that if you want to argue with someone, you have to first agree to not agree upon them. To go against otherwise requires you to disagree with the premise of arguing in the first place.
Well, who says that any social interaction needs to function like argumentation does? Like, I have a reason for thinking that's the case, kind of, but it's very different from your reason. So what is your reason?
Social interaction requires the action or process of reasoning systematically in support of an idea, action, or theory. So if you want to trade, you must participate in arguing. If you want to talk with someone, you're expressing an idea or an action to someone, so that is also arguing. Pretty much every social interaction requires argumentation.
Sure, but the definition of free trade is, like, fundamentally based on property rights. That
Property
seems
rights
like
is
the
a different
argument.
debate. Property rights is a different debate, unrelated. Trade requires property, sure, but the main focus of this is argumentation and process of trading resources.
Okay, but like if I want to talk to someone so they can help me find the nearest coffee shop or something, how exactly does that appeal to non-aggression?
Because they don't punch you immediately, and you're not forcing that information out of them. By simply talking to them, you are not aggressing and therefore appeal to non-aggression.
Well, why couldn't I, though? Like, you're assuming I'm not. Why couldn't I? Or why is it, like, inconsistent too?
Well, because, okay, if you go up to someone and punch them in the way to get the information out, that is obviously not arguing, and it's definitely not socially positive. It's a logically incoherent to say that you want to participate in argumentation while also forcing information out of someone. That's not
Well,
an
you're
expression
the
of an
one
idea.
claiming. No, you're the one claiming that I'm appealing to argumentation by asking someone where a coffee shop is.
Yeah.
So if I walk up to someone and ask for a coffee shop, and then they don't really want to tell me, or they're kind of busy, and so then, yeah, I use violence to try and force them to tell me. Like,
Then
none
you're
of this is
contradicting your previous peaceful. That is contradicting your previous peaceful stance of asking the question in the first place. If you're going to resort to the violence after not getting an answer instead of just moving on to someone else, you are contradicting any previous stance on peaceful argumentation.
Am I contradicting my previous stance I had by talking to him peacefully, or am I contradicting the stance that I'm appealing to by making arguments elsewhere? Those are two different things here.
If you asked a question and did not get a response, then if you want to remain logically consistent, you would go on to someone else ask. But by going on to attack them to get the information out, you're contradicting a peaceful question that you obviously took a part in.
But what norms am I contradicting? Like, what makes you think I have those norms? Because in order to contradict a norm, well, I mean, you can contradict any norm, but in order to contradict a norm that you yourself prescribe, you have to be the one already, like, using the norm. You already have to be appealing to the norm through other behavior. Like, if I walk up and talk to someone, that's not the same thing as me saying I'm a pacifist. And yet that's, like, similar to what you're saying. Like,
Not really, because you could be.
Even a true egoist would have peaceful conversations because they can just be easier in most cases. That doesn't make them inconsistent.
It kind of does. If you are talking to one person about something and then just randomly attack them because they refuse to answer the question of yours, that's you disagreeing with your previous sense of just talking. If it's something else on top of that, that's a contradiction of states. From one state of non-aggression to another of aggression.
Okay, to go back to what my argument was during my opening. Like, I never cheat or hack in Minecraft, and then I turn around and hack in Gary's mod or Counter-Strike or something. That's not me being inconsistent. I'm perfectly consistent with my principle of never cheating or hacking in Minecraft. For someone who's like an egoist, it would be the same thing. So that idea of saying this kind of like absolutist fallacy doesn't make sense. And that's what I think this is an absolutist fallacy. Because you're saying you never cheat or hack in Minecraft, therefore you never cheat or hack in any game. Because to cheat or hack in any game would be contradictory with your like value that cheating and hacking is bad in Minecraft. It just doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur fallacy.
Okay. I don't see. Okay, I did say that you can reappeal to it if you, in later circumstances, if you undo or take punishment for the harms you committed. So, for example, if you said, as well as you brought up, if you cheat in one game and cheat another, those are two different areas that you were cheating and don't really apply those two different arguments. Don't know why that was used as an example, but if you were to steal and in return the property, you would be undoing any breaking of the NAP you previously committed, since you are returning, well, undoing the aggression that you originally committed. And it doesn't. It seems like you made a false equivalency by comparing this to Minecraft, since these are social interactions versus telling a truth about one category and doing something contradictory that's in another category.
Well, yeah, the only way for you to be correct here is if I did make a false equivalent. But I don't think I did, because again, if you appeal to some norms, because ultimately what it means to appeal to norms is to appeal to some rule set that's relevant in some specific circumstance. Your idea is based on the idea that appealing to a set of rules in a specific circumstance necessarily means that you must agree to those rules in all circumstances. And that, well, when I say it like that, that's very obviously not true. But if you
That's not
apply
what
it
I
to
said, though.
arguments, if you apply it to arguments, it's like equivalent to what you were saying earlier, though. By engaging in the argumentation process, I'm appealing to non-aggression. Therefore, non-aggression should be a principle I remain consistent with in all of my behavior. No, that's not. For the same reason that doesn't apply. Can you show that how these are completely different?
The MAP is presupposed during argumentation during that process. So, if you want to continue arguing, you must continue to not aggress. If you want to participate in any argumentation and to have social interaction, you would agree to not aggress in that moment. Sure, you could aggress in other moments, but that would be contradicting previous previous states of arguing with them. And if you wanted someone to continue to be willing to argue with you in the future, you must, of course, continue to appeal to the non-aggression. Doing otherwise would be contradictory as well as counterfactual to any wants to argumentate.
Okay. Yeah, no, again, you're just like stating it as fact. Like if I make an if I'm trying to like I'm doing an I'm engaging in argumentation right now. And yeah, I'm engaging in argumentation right now. That doesn't mean I should follow the NAP as like a universal principle. Just because I'm following it at least kind of right now. Because these are two different circumstances we're speaking of here. This is argumentation, and argumentation works best, and arguments are most like rationally argued for if we don't randomly attack each other. It makes sense. But that doesn't mean that in all circumstances you should be non-aggressive. It doesn't mean that. I mean, that might be true for other reasons, but it's not true because of it being the case for the argumentation process. The reason non-aggression is good for argumentation is because it prevents like irrational arguments from gaining priority for irrational reasons. Because trying to claim that your argument is correct because you're stronger isn't a valid argument. But that same logic doesn't apply elsewhere, and that's why I would say that it doesn't give you any kind of universal principle you can just pull out in any situation. Now, you could say that other situations, or that most situations, should appeal to like truth seeking in some more vague way, but then first of all, different situations that like appeal to truth-seeking or rational deliberation, like what I was talking about, they appeal to much more than just non-aggression. They appeal to like good faith reasoning and making sure that your arguments aren't themselves irrational in the first place, which, the ability to make irrational arguments is something the NAP very, like, pretty much explicitly says is okay, because you're not acting in a way that's aggressive, and yet it's contrary to rational deliberation again. And also, like, if I'm having an argument with an opponent, and I'm trying to make a persuasive argument where I'm trying to make a positive claim that they ought to believe X, I need to appeal to their interests in order to make the argument in the first place. And so, if you're having some interaction with someone where truth seeking is valuable, you have to appeal to their interests if you actually want to make an argument that they ought to, like, believe is correct, assuming they agree with the premises. Because you can't make them agree with the premises without having, like, the premises be like guided to them. Like, imagine I was trying to argue that 1 + 1 = 2 to you. In order to do this, I can't just make an argument in a way, like, I could just make an argument, but then you could just, like, not believe in it. So if I want to make an argument that you ought to believe relative to assumptions you already hold, then I have to appeal to your assumptions. I have to appeal to your values. I have to appeal to your desires. I have to appeal to your interests. And the way to do that for something like 1 + 1 = 2 is I would have to appeal to like piano arithmetic or something, and then explain why the rules of piano arithmetic are something you should take note of because they're very useful in counting things, and counting things are very useful for like figuring out what's most rational to like handle money or whatever. And stuff that you would probably care about. I have to appeal to all these things, and then that'll give you a reason to believe my claim that you should believe 1 + 1 = 2, because it's just so useful in all these contexts and based on the assumptions you already hold about the value of counting money or whatever, and also your basic like value of like reason and appeals to reason. Therefore, you should believe 1 + 1 = 2. Therefore, based on the assumptions and values you already hold, you should believe 1 + 1 = 2. But I have to appeal to your interests even to do something like that. So clearly, from that, all arguments need you to appeal to the interests of your opponent. And of course, arguments where it's just one guy trying to defend himself from the other guy aren't always the best kind of arguments. Like, people should be going back and forth, both trying to seek the truth, not win over the other, right? So that means both people or all parties in some interaction where truth seeking is valuable, they should all be respecting the value of each other's interests. That has nothing to do with the NAP.
I would say you're factually incorrect that argumentation appeals to interests. For example, while you did say that for argumentation process to continue, you need to appeal to some level of interests. I think that is debatable, but that's not really the focus of what I'm going to say. That's a part of the process of argumentation, but not required for argumentation to start. Argumentation requires non-aggression essentially to begin and to continue, and is a constant part of argumentation. Anytime aggression is brought into argumentation, argumentation breaks down, and, well, we get chaos. Appealing to interests is only a part of bringing them over to your side or to come to a conclusion that is acceptable to both sides. Appealing to interests is simply a tool of debate, not an argumentation, not an actual requirement of it.
If you're arguing like against your landlord, they can just evict you. And let's assume that they wrote into the contract that they can evict you for any reason, and that's legal to do so because the law doesn't regulate blah blah blah. Then you can have an argument with them, but but you can't really have true rational deliberation with your landlord unless they agree to not abuse their power, unless they agree that they're not just going to evict you if you make an argument that offends them or something. If you actually want to sit down and have a discussion with them, which is something that's perfectly valid to do and is actually a good example of when, like, not argumentation norms, but rather what's required for like persuasive arguments, when that should apply in different circumstances, I would say this is one of them very clearly. Because, yeah, being able to properly converse with people in a way that can allow you and them to both try and reach ground truth is valuable for pretty much any interaction, right? So in that sense, it should appeal to norms of argumentation. And yeah, one of those norms is appealing to interests, because if the landlord doesn't appeal to your interests at all, then they'll just evict you the moment you make an argument that offends them, and then rational deliberation can't happen. So for rational deliberation to work, and for you to be able to actually have like a good faith discussion or whatever you want to call it with your landlord, they need to not they need to not aggress, but they also need to not transgress against you, as in they need to not make acts that are inherently frustrating to your interests. It just kind of pops out of there. So, like, do you have an argument against this idea that actually they can just evict you at any time, and that doesn't make the argumentation invalid? Because I think pretty clearly it does, or at least like hurts it in some way.
No, I would disagree with the idea that you having power in terms of like material wealth affects how argumentation occurs. I personally do not care how wealthy someone is or if my livelihood relies upon them.
Okay, in
And
that
also,
case, you can continue.
yeah, and also this is while you're talking, I say you split it up into good discussion and bad discussion. Doesn't mean that means that it's not a universal principle that is presupposed when arguing. You already admitted to yourself by creating that distinction.
Wait, what did I appeal to? Or I mean, like, what did I accept implicitly?
You split argumentation into good and bad faith discussions, which means that your idea of appealing to interests is not a universal part of all argumentation.
Well, I kind of use that just like as a half-assed way of phrasing it. I think an actual like bad faith argument isn't a rational argument. It's not a because it's not a good way to get to ground truth, thus making it like irrational. It's not a like a truly it's not truly rational deliberation if there's some like functional if there's some like interaction going on in the background that's functionally forcing people to make arguments they wouldn't normally make, or functionally again forcing people to not make arguments that they want to make for fear of consequences, whether that force is like violent force or whether it's just basically like spooks, like oh no, I can't make this, or I can't make an argument that's too strong because then they'll like get mad at me and I don't want that. And so I'm going to try and hold back, and then you end up like losing the debate or not being able to argue what you actually want because of that. That clearly is not compatible with rational deliberation, and rationally should be something that's avoided if you actually want to get to ground truth. Like the only thing I really need to like defend that claim is one, the idea that your landlord threatening to evict you if you make too crazy of an argument will affect how you argue. And of course it will. That's obviously true. And secondly, that like arguments that are like less capable at actually getting to ground truth are worse. And for that I just have to appeal to the value of truth itself, which again we both agree with.
The thing is, when it comes to most argumentation, like for example, well, there's the example that you brought up of the landlords, there is no ground truth. There is simply a compromise that is found between both parties. A rationality isn't really needed for it because you can have an irrational common grounds that is chosen eventually. It could be either just being evicted and you finding somewhere else, which would be irrational for the landlord since they lose out on their tenants, or it could be a completely rational one where they decide to come to an agreement where where one side pays rent to have access to the house. This is not an appeal to rationality or an appeal to interests. It's simply a fact of the matter that one side has more power.
Okay. Like I think I might partly agree with that, but like the idea that if you're arguing with someone what they're like obliged to actually respect is based on whether like the argumentation is actually trying to reach some truth claim. But even then, anyone involved in some discussion is going to have to appeal to truth in some way anyway, even if two people are like discussing what makes more philosophical sense relative to some standard. They're still reaching a truth claim. They're not reaching a truth of philosophy, but they're reaching a truth that this philosophical claim is, at least most likely, the best way to blah 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 under some random standard. Like there's still like a hint of truth going on here. The same way like if mathematicians are arguing whether this equation is correct or whether this other equation is correct, they have to appeal to the rules of math themselves, but to call it a subjective debate in any way wouldn't make sense. To say they're not getting at ground truth, like perhaps not absolute ground truth, but they're getting at some form of truth relative to the rules of mathematics that they're arguing with. So like if my sink was broken and I called up my landlord like, hey, my sink's broken, you need to fix it, and then they went, I'm gonna evict you now. Like that's not. I'm trying to make an argument. Hey, my sink is broken. You need to fix it. That's what the contract says. And then they go, yeah, the contract says I can also evict you at any time. Haha. And then they just like kick you out. Like the truth that's being violated isn't that the contract forces them to fix the sink. If the contract lets them evict you at any moment, then the contract lets them evict you at any moment. But that being done in a way that prevents you from actually talking to them is harmful for either of you to actually know what's going on. And like again, if we're appealing to truth, that's something that's fundamentally bad. If I was to say, if I was like, um, if I was like working at an office job and I had to like, I had to file some reports or whatever, then I should be able to explain what those reports are to my boss, like in good faith, in a way that actually like explains whatever it is I'm doing. And I shouldn't feel threatened that my boss is just gonna fire me if I say something he doesn't like. That's not that's not good relative to like actually like functional discussions in an office space, which is valuable to like how that like a space like that would even function. And so my boss by just firing me for no reason there would be contradicting uh the the best ways for people to interact in such a space. That's not the best way to word it, but the idea is there because if he fires me for filing reports and talking about them in a way he doesn't like, even if it's in the contract that he can do that, that still completely destroys the whole like system behind the workplace. No one's gonna want to talk to him about stuff that's valuable to talk about, and in that case, that is very obviously going against the value of rational deliberation because it's going against the whole point of it. The whole point of rational deliberation is so that people can get the truth and people can like try and reason amongst each other. If they're not able to do that, then the boss could easily go and have an argument with me, and then I could respond, well, yeah, but why should I listen to your argument when the way you run this place is fundamentally opposed to argument and discussion? It doesn't make sense.
I do not see why or how this actually applies to argumentation. Rational deliberation and argumentation are two separate things, as deliberation is a subcategory of argumentation. And being fired for making an argument that your opponent doesn't like is simply isn't like the same level as using aggression to break the argument. The employer agreed to this on the past, where if they could just fire you for whatever reason, and you agreed to that via argumentation. You going against this would be going against your previous arguments that you made in favor of your employment. So I don't particularly see why interests need to be appealed to, and also if your employer has the interest of firing you, that for whatever reason is a rational interest on their end.
Okay, what about force prevents, like, what about one opponent using the threat of force specifically? What about that prevents rational argumentation or rational deliberation or the ability to make persuasive arguments, etc., etc.? Because I think we can both agree that one opponent threatening force against another with no other context is very clearly like opposed to and conflicts with and prevents blah 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 rational argumentation, rational deliberation, the ability to make persuasive arguments that actually function in the first place. Like it goes against all of these things. What is your reason for that? I have a reason for that, and it's going to be very different from yours. What is your reason to say that force goes against these things at all?
Well, force is an immediate breaking down of argumentation, whereas a threat of force doesn't break down argumentation immediately. It can lead to it, and will affect how argumentation plays out, but it's not going to break it down immediately. Whereas use of force, it breaks down argumentation immediately.
So if I'm like, so I mean, we're having a debate right now. If I suddenly like threatened violence against you, that without actually doing anything, that wouldn't stop this argument from functioning. Like this wouldn't stop the argument from
No, it wouldn't.
being like qualifying as rational argumentation.
It would be a rational argumentation, but rational isn't part of the definition of argumentation.
Well, sure, but you could have like pseudo argumentation where it's not really argumentation, where you could call it irrational argumentation if you wanted because it looks like argumentation, but then it doesn't actually function properly because blah 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 is going on. But you think
The
you think this
functionality or the rationality of an argument does not change where everyone else is in arguments. If you make it so that rationality is required for argumentation, then large amounts of arguments are irrational and therefore not arguments. Simply stating that rationality is a requirement for debate means that you can't actually use argumentation effects for your justification.
Well, I would say if you like accept any argument whose conclusion gives you like a normative claim of belief, like you ought to believe X, etc. And pretty much everybody believes at least one argument like that, right? That's why we believe things. So if you have any beliefs about anything, then you agree with some persuasive argument. And guess what? Those persuasive arguments aren't going to work very well if you can't be sure that you actually agree with the premises. And you can't be sure if you agree with the premises if someone's threatening you with violence, because then even what you say stops having any meaning because you could just be trying to defend yourself, and what they're saying you just have to go along with. Like it's fundamentally at odds with it. Like how can two people try and reach? How could two people ever try and reach truth if they both feel threatened by the other? That fundamentally doesn't make sense. And actually, yeah. But beyond just the threat of force, what makes the use of force actually like invalidate an argument? Actually, like destroy rational argumentation?
Uh, Okay, so the use of force breaks argumentation because you're swapping from trying to express ideas through a process of reasoning, or it. Okay, so it doesn't fit the definition of argumentation and breaks any form of argumentation that is understood. As I said earlier, the definition of argumentation is the action or process of reasoning systematically in support of an idea, action, or theory. Using force goes against this, as it's not reasoning or appealing. Well, not it's not expressing an idea. It's just force.
Okay. Neither is. Wait, it's not expressing an idea. Okay, yeah, but if we're arguing and then I start juggling while I'm arguing, that doesn't violate rational argumentation. That doesn't really do anything. So there's more to it than just that.
Yeah, but using force as part of the arguments, as like punching someone to get a question out of them or to prove your points is not is not argumentation. That's a separate thing.
Right. Then again, and so in any interaction focused on truth, if one person just starts aggressing upon the other, that prevents any kind of like rational interaction for that kind of reason, right? Because because it doesn't allow you to actually argue on behalf of reason at all.
No, my
it's like
reasoning being is
it's like
Oh,
an
sorry,
ad
go ahead.
hominem fallacy or something.
No. My reasoning being for why argumentation breaks is not because it stops arguing from continue, but rather it places argumentation with force, a difference in direction. By being violent, you're giving up on the peaceful approach of arguing and being in favor of just using force. Not arguing for an idea, not providing a rationale or reason. It's just force.
Real quick, I would like to remind you that we have 10 minutes left in this section.
Yeah.
Okay, I feel like in the same way, if you're having like a debate with your landlord about obligations or whatever, especially if it's something more subjective, and then they just pull out the evict card on you and like, shush, or I'm just gonna evict you. That like invalidates rational argumentation for the same reason you just described. You're no longer having like an actual like argumentative conversation. You can no longer be deliberating. You can no longer be making persuasive arguments. You can no longer be trying to get a ground truth because threatening eviction isn't the same thing as an argument. The same thing you just said. And also the other things I said. I think the other stuff I said is still true, but yeah, even by your logic, I don't see how you can separate something like the use of force from the use of power more broadly, because it functions in the exact same way. And again, neither are like part of an actual argument. They're basically like a fallacy, kind of. You just toss that out, and okay, we're no longer trying to figure out what is true. We're no longer debating what claims or definitions or really anything. We're not discussing or creating ideas. Instead, it's just you're just gonna evict me if I say this, therefore I shouldn't.
Yeah, but I don't agree with that. Force is an application of force and violence onto another that's harms the other. Whereas disallowing access to your rented property is just simply removing access to a resource that you had. One is so in the first case it's negative, and in the second you're losing a positive.
You're appealing to like the fact that they have the right to evict you because they already own the house. That has nothing to do with what interactions actually hurt the discussion and what doesn't. That's just appealing to like outside circumstances, and that could appeal to anything. You have to basically appeal to property rights in order to support the idea that argumentation only presupposes the NAP, and that's circular reasoning. The whole point of like the argumentation ethics is the idea that the act of argumentation presupposes the NAP, and from that you can kind of get like property rights and self-ownership and blah blah blah. You cannot use property rights or self-ownership as the explanation for why arguments only presuppose the NAP. Because if we don't assume if we don't assume property rights, and we try and show that argumentation presupposes the NAP, and we instead show that you have to like not evict the guy you're discussing, then what you're showing is that arguments don't appeal to the NAP at all. They appeal to interests. And then if that's the case, you cannot use an appeal to property rights to fix the problem, because you can't appeal to property rights in that sense anymore. It just doesn't work. You can't, at least not in an absolute sense, no.
Okay. That's a whole bunch of baloney. I was simply showing the distinction between violent aggression and restricting access to resource. I wasn't saying that the NAP appeals to property rights.
Yeah, you're appealing to property rights by saying the landlord can evict you during a discussion, and then saying that them threatening to evict you doesn't prevent argumentation because they own the house. That has nothing to do with whether it does or doesn't disrupt conversation or disrupt the ability to rationally argue or find ground truth or anything. It has nothing to do with that. And the only way it could, maybe, is if you take property rights to be something higher than argumentation norms, which goes against the entire concept of argumentation ethics to begin with.
Okay. No, you didn't let me finish earlier. I said I wasn't appealing to your property rights earlier. I was simply
you
making a distinction. Anyway, the main difference between the two is that okay, if someone threatens to evict you from their rental if you don't argue in a specific manner, you are agreeing. If you want to continue arguing, you still have to appeal to non-aggression. This isn't an appeal to interests. How does this doesn't break argumentation? Just simply limits how argumentation goes. It's still not appeal to interests is not universally applicable to argumentation. Still.
It's universally applicable to any kind of ability to make a persuasive argument. To make a persuasive argument, you need to assume general normative rationalism, the idea that it's like you ought to act rationally, because otherwise, why should they accept your argument on rational grounds? And you also need to appeal to the interests of whatever parties you're arguing against. And if multiple people are working in tandem, arguing with each other, which is better anyway, then they all need to be acting with reference to each other's interests.
Yeah, but that's again, that's still only like a small portion of argumentation. That's not a universal law of argumentation versus non-aggression, which is required for every argument.
Okay, take the argument that you're making on behalf of argumentation ethics itself. That is in and of itself an argument. An argument whose conclusion is that rationally, because of consistency and all these things, you rationally ought to follow the NAP. That's ultimately what you're saying, and that is a persuasive argument. So if you concede ever that persuasive arguments force you to appeal to interests, then you concede that your very argument for the NAP forces you to appeal to interests and also sows the seeds for being able to say that actually argumentation doesn't necessarily appeal to the NAP, at least in an absolute sense. Obviously, aggression is bad for argumentation. Nobody really disagrees with that. But the idea that that means aggression is always bad, like what if aggression enforces fairness or enforces like the ability for people to be able to argue in the first place because someone kept trying to evict the other guy? It stops working. So like do persuasive arguments appeal to interests or not?
No,
They
they
don't.
can, but they persuasive arguments do not necessarily require to appeal to interests. In fact, they could
How can
appeal it can appeal entirely to my own interests and not to the other party and still be persuasive. And
No.
also, I noticed you tried sneaking that if you appeal to interests, you can get rid of non-aggression, but non-aggression is still constantly required by all forms of argumentation, no matter what.
No. How can you have an argument that doesn't appeal to your opponent's interests while still being persuasive? That goes against the very concept of persuasion. Again, I'm defining persuasive argument here as an argument that reaches a conclusion that says the opponent ought to believe X. Right? You're trying to make a conclusion that tells them that they ought to believe X. You cannot claim that they ought to believe X without appealing to something that they already agree with. That's logically impossible. You have to appeal to something they agree with or value.
I have not once appealed to any of your interests. In fact, I've done my best to go against your interests.
Yes,
whereas
you have. You've appealed to rationalism.
No, I haven't.
This whole argument is based on reason. This whole argument is based on rational arguments. The only reason I'm paying attention to what you're saying is because it's in some way coherent. If I didn't care about rationalism at all, and I would just believe any argument that sounded cool, then if your argument doesn't sound cool enough, I could just reject it. But I'm not. I'm not rejecting it because it doesn't sound cool. So in that sense, you're appealing to my rationalism by making an argument in a way where you assume I'm gonna at least kind of listen to the argument, because if the argument if it's you're using you have premises, and then from those premises you prove things. If I agree with your premises, then I need to agree with you. You're appealing to that very concept. So not only are you appealing to rationalism, thereby building an argument through premises, but you're also appealing to the value of persuasive arguments. You're trying to make a persuasive argument against me, trying to say that I rationally ought to believe that NAP argumentation ethics is valid. So in that sense, you're performing a performative contradiction.
Not really, because you're using rationalism and interests in a different term. Interests usually mean like personal beliefs that are not universal. So so saying that you're appealing to rationalism while also saying that you have diverting interests is well, dishonest.
Well,
At base.
Real quick, we have reached the 40-minute mark. I will let Tony get in his response because he seems to be in the middle of it. But after that, we will have to shift to closing statements. During closing statements, feel free to summarize or respond to anything that was said.
Okay. Again, I would say like appealing to rationalism, like the reason your argument it can qualify as a persuasive argument and can qualify as something that is trying to give the conclusion that I ought to believe X is because you're appealing to rationalism because you know it'll like make me be convinced if I agree with all the premises. I don't agree with all the premises. That's why I don't agree. But I do agree with the rationalist part. So you are appealing to an interest in that sense. I don't see how what you said earlier contradicts that either.
All right, now we will move to closing statements. You'll have 6 minutes for this. Since I gave Tony a little bit of extra time, I'll let Killergummybear start on this end. So the floor is yours. Whenever you start speaking, the timer will start.
Okay. Well, my closing statement will be this. I have not seen any actual arguments as to why arguments do not require non-aggression, and I think Tony has a few times admitted that it requires it. But non-aggression is a factual requirement of argumentation, and appealing to interests is not a requirement either. Someone can also be completely rational or refuse rationalism as a epistemology while still participating in argumentation. For example, empiricists are not excluded from argumentation just because they do not appeal to rationalism, and nor are rationalists excluded from argumentation with empiricists just because they have different epistemology. And appealing to saying that an appeal to interest is an appeal to rationalism is just a false equivalency. Interests in epistemology are different from the definition of interest. Definition of interest being personal behaviors that are exclusive to you. And that'll be all.
All right, Tony, now you can go. You have 6 minutes. Timer starts
Okay.
when you begin speaking.
So am I not allowed to respond to any of that? Or what?
You're allowed to respond to any of his points or summarize your own or both. It's up to you.
Yeah, okay. I would say argumentation does not require the NAP as a principle. It requires non-aggression in general as well as non-abuse. Abuse as in like non-violent coercion, making people do things through like a threat of negative consequences, abuse of power, that kind of thing. The kind of thing that can violate the ability for people to search ground truth in a rational discussion, blah blah blah, like what I was saying earlier. And also, the idea that empiricism isn't based on rationalism, it is. Empiricism is like founded in the scientific method, and that is very much a rationalist position. And the reason it works, it can be justified rationally. And all rationalism really means is they appeal to reason. It would be ridiculous to say that the scientific method is unreasonable, obviously. And I think it's pretty like I could spend like 10 minutes trying to dissect this, but I think it's pretty self-evident that it's not unreasonable to say that the scientific method is based in reason. And if the scientific method is based in reason, then empiricism, based on the scientific method, is also based in reason, and thus empiricism is based on rationalism. It all comes from rationalism. Someone arguing on behalf of the scientific method isn't appealing to anything different from someone else arguing based on deduction. They're both like rationalist principles. Also, also like as a final statement in regards to what I was saying earlier, any interaction between different parties where people's like where people are trying to seek ground truth, they need to appeal to each other's interests. Because if they don't, no argument can be made that convinces anybody else. Speaking very, very vaguely, but in essence, I think this is true. Whenever people act or interact through shared reasoning rather than coercion or manipulation, the fulfillment of interests principle is implicitly required. Shared reasoning is more rational than individual reasoning, and furthermore, any rational interaction with another should be based on reason rather than coercion or manipulation, immediately making it the same kind of civil interaction as previously mentioned. Since general normative rationalism is assumed as a fundamental assumption behind any persuasive argument, rational interaction ought to be the universal form of interaction. This rational interaction, civil interaction, must thus appeal to the fulfillment of interests. Therefore, solely by the virtue of accepting any persuasive argument, any interaction between individuals ought to appeal to the fulfillment of interests as a universal principle. Therefore, rationally, all interactions ought to uphold the fulfillment of interest as a principle, or more specifically, like the value of interests, because that's the only way you can have like an actual persuasive or self-coherent discussion about anything in any way that implies you're seeking truth. And again, this is all done without, this can all be explained without appealing to what's required in the argumentation process itself, thus falling for the category error and the problem where, you can't universalize it because it's only relative to this context. No, I'm saying that respect of the interests of those you're interacting with, the fulfillment of interests for whoever you're interacting with at any given moment, that's something that needs to be appealed to as a premise of any persuasive argument you make. So if you make a persuasive argument or you agree with persuasive arguments, that fulfillment of interests of those you're interacting with as a value needs to be appealed to as a premise of the argument itself, not something relative only to the process, but as an actual premise of the argument. I'm done. Yeah. Oh, he's muted.
All right, that will be time then. So now we will move on to the Q&A where people can come up and ask any questions they want. So if anyone wants to ask a question, I would recommend saying in the chat that you would like to ask one, and then I'll invite you to speak.
Yeah, I'm open to any questions, including questions of definitions and stuff, especially because there's a lot of weird talk here, like what is interests? What do I mean when I say, oh, you value something?
Here, I guess I'll ask one while we wait for other people to hop in.
Yeah.
So, oh yeah. Oh.
The hand raising's still disabled.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. I'll have to fix that later.
Nope, 2 up.
You wanna be brave. Anyways, so my question, I guess, to start off the Q&A is the Killergummybear. So, could you put your argument for the NAP in the form of a syllogism? So, a logically valid syllogism. Could you put your argument in that format?
Okay. Now or later? I assume
Like
now.
now. Well, yeah, that's my question. Now.
Okay. Well, for our argumentation to occur, you must first agree to not attack the person. Otherwise, that would just be starting of a conflict rather than arguments. While participating in argumentation, you must also continue to appeal to non-aggression. Otherwise, argumentation breaks down. And for a conclusion of argumentation to be valid, you must continue to agree to not aggress. Otherwise, argumentation breaks down post. So from that, I can conclude that non-aggression is a requirement for argumentation along all parts of it.
Okay. I think Parfit has a question. I'll invite him to speak. All right, I invited him to speak. All right, he's up.
There you go. Hey, what's up, guys? I have a question directed towards Killergummybear. Okay, so one of my issues that I have with the NAP is that there's this proposition that it is wrong to use force against others unless doing so is necessary to stop someone else from using force against others, right? Now, I think that like most people would, I mean, at least you would believe in that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the issue that I have with this is that, you know, but in fact, you know, almost no one, even libertarians, believe in NAP, either because it's obviously just false or that, and we just show them examples like this. Like, so say for whatever reason, right? You know, say that for whatever reason we are considering, you know, someone who, you know, say Hoppa owns like this like super large plot of land around his house, and one day, you know, when he emerges from this house to collect this, you know, copy of Reasons, right? Cool book on Reasons. He sees me, you know, sleeping peacefully in a corner of his lawn. So though haven't hurt anyone, and you know, believing everything, and you know, pretty weak, right? I pose like no physical threat to anyone, but Hans is like nonetheless, you know, irritated and demands that I get off his lawn, and I just, you know, plug my ears and just go back to sleep. Now, almost everyone, I suspect, Han thinks that, you know, they can use, you know, force to expel me from his lawn, right? We think that he has the authority to do so or no?
Yes, he does. You're aggressing on his property by being there. Removing you from it is simply ending the aggression.
Yeah. So then imagine then, you know, say this scenario changed where I, you know, I became very injured by the hit and run drive, right? Hit and run driver, right? And I needed to take I need to be taken to somewhere near like a hospital immediately, right? And the only available car is his car, right? But say that he's not around to give me like a permission, and I think it's really like unlikely for him to give me any authority to save me at all. So would you think it's permissible to break into Hoppa's car,
Well,
thus initiating force against his property?
Well, legally speaking, that would not be allowed. But in terms of needs, you would be allowed to. I did put this in my opener where someone can reappeal to the laws of argumentation by returning the property and paying back for any harm done. So yes, you would be able to take to get to the hospital, but you must also return it.
But it's going to be conditioned on like the repaying back. But say that I don't have the money to repay you back, and I destroyed your car for the sake of my safety, right? Actually, we can even change it a bit. So we can say like, and this might be a little silly, but I think it's pretty obviously true. Like, say that I took a hair from Hoppa, right? And say that each time I take a bit of their hair, there's almost megatons of suffering that's relieved from a distinct, you know, planet where there's Martians who are constantly suffering in pain all the time. You're saying that I have done something morally wrong in alleviating the suffering of, you know, billions and trillions of like Martians that are currently in pain, constantly, and I took like a megaton of, you know, suffering to be reduced down only by just initiating force against his property, in this case, his body.
I would say that this is not a moral thing to do. I do not believe in utilitarianism or the increase of utility being a good thing, and nor do I consider the joy of far-off aliens to be a morally good substance.
He's not appealing to utilitarianism. He's appealing to
that's just like,
consequentialism.
yeah, that's true, because utilitarianism just be implying too long-winded, but implying other sort of like theses that probably isn't relevant to the thought experiment. So, okay, yeah, I don't know. Okay, then the last thing I have is that, look, you agree that your dog is your property, presumably, right?
Yes.
Okay, and you can do whatever you want with your property, presumably.
Oh, he's doing something. There are definitely limits to it.
Okay, what are the limits that? Oh, what is the limits? I'm curious. Like, what are the limits that like why is it wrong to say you killer to grab your puppy and do unspeakable acts? Like, what's the issue with that? It's your property.
Okay, there are different definitions of property within the definition of property. So, for example, a parent owns their child, but that doesn't mean that they have full ownership of them. This is called stewardship. It's where they have the ability to look after and to take care of, but you who do not have the rights to abuse the animal.
Wait, but why? Okay, why do we think that stewardship would be applicable to dogs? Like, we agree that maybe it could be applicable to, say, say for example, your child, right? You don't own your child in any way, but why would it be applicable to dogs? I'm confused.
Okay, the main reason is that the definition of ownership within libertarianism is first use or cultivation of land or resource. Say, that you can't really use or cultivate a dog until it's been killed, so you can't really torture or rape a dog while it's alive. And even after death, it's questionable ethically.
Why? Well, presumably, like, it's not really. Well, presumably, the only thing that you have to consider is just avoid. As far as I know, is not to. It's wrong to use force against others unless doing. Well, essentially, it's wrong to initiate force, against others, right? So there's something in principle objecting or prohibiting such an action, unless others includes non-mind beings, or more specifically non-agent beings. Then I'm not really sure why that would be applicable to dogs. Seems pretty strange.
They need to be cultivated or used, and since you can't really do that till the animal can no longer take care of itself, e.g., like its organs are functioning, this is unapplicable. And also, I don't believe in just propertarianism. I also believe in Christian virtue ethics. So I
Yeah,
would
but right now
definitely
the dispute
consider this to
is.
be.
Well, yeah, but
This is a
this is a tangential.
this is a tangential
I want to be
argument, so
very
not
clear. That's
applying to
more
NAP.
towards that's more the virtue ethics is doing most of the work there as opposed to just the NEP. And if you think that the NEP is supposed
The
to
NAP
be
is a
functionally just
legal
like
the NAP is not a full morality. It's a base legal system for most
well,
things.
to be clear,
I do.
Well, I think that it depends on who you're speaking to, but there has been people who propose it as at least some normative constraint in your actions, right? So it's not totally deviated to just only like institutions prohibiting what your actions are, but like towards maybe just like social norms in general. So it certainly does.
Most libertarians do not appeal into the NAP by itself. Like most ANCAPs that I know of, also do not keep to just the NAP. This is a tangential
Well, yeah, but the debate
argument
currently right
that's
now
not
hindered. Well, no, to be clear, this argument currently right now is on whether or not we should believe in the NEP, not about whether or not, hey, does this libertarian specifically has the ability to utilize the NEP in conjunction with other moral theories that she has, or they have in proposal, right? I mean, that's not interesting to me. Presumably, the thing that's what's interesting is about whether NEP is true, and I don't think NEP is true. I think that entails silly cases like those. I think that
no, it doesn't.
One, you haven't really. Well, that's why I asked you before. Why do we attribute, thinking that dogs have any sort of property right claim, or some sort of agency? Presumably, we think that's going to be in virtue of someone that has a mind and is able to be responsive to reasons. We don't think dogs are responsive to reasons at all. So,
well, again, this is something else. This is propertarianism, not the NAP. The NAP is a principle that is a part of other ethics, not an ethic in of itself.
Yeah, I agree that there could be other theses that you can add to the conjunction. The point here is if it doesn't rule out no true, sure, like and also like the other thing that I haven't mentioned and you guys were talking about before when it comes to argumentation ethics, like what if just someone says, look, I mean, the reason for why I don't want to hurt you is because it's just my values, it's just in accordance with my approvals and disapprovals of such actions, and I would want a society to not have people do this, and I want at least an institution to force things like that. Why is argumentation ethics somehow relevant in explaining things that already you can explain by just appealing to your sort of standards? I'm a little bit confused.
Because this is about
real quick, that is gonna have to be the last Poodle because I don't want to have him.
Yeah, my bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're
Red,
good. You're good.
Riot,
You're good.
Yeah, Riot has a question, so I'll let Gummy Bear respond, then I'll request up Riot.
Okay.
Very good.
What you're appealing to is morality rather than ethics or law. The NAP is about law, which is saying what you may not do. There are other rules that you may of what you may or may not do, but the NAP is just one of many. That is outside of the NAP and is part of other parts of ethics.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for our question.
All right. Red Riot, welcome to the panel. What's your question?
All right, so Killergummybear, argumentation ethics is often accused of committing the is-ought fallacy, and obviously everything that is shouldn't be a moral or normative or even an ethical ought. So why should the non-aggression that is required for argumentation be an ethical ought, that you ought not aggress someone?
Well, if you want, that then comes to the question of if you want to participate in argumentation, which includes society, trade, bartering, anything that requires one or more other people, you must appeal to non-aggression. So, the ought comes from if you want to participate in that, you ought to do this.
That appeals to the normative value of your own interests.
And the other question I had is, how exactly do Hoppians and libertarians and people who use argumentation ethics make the distinction between consistency and affirmation? Because being consistent with non-aggression doesn't necessarily mean that you affirm argumentation ethics. Kind of like how, for example, a white liberal vegan and a radical Islamist both don't eat pork. They are both consistent with the ethic of not eating pork, but for massively different reasons. So how could this not also be a situation where someone doesn't confirm argumentation ethics, they just happen to align with it in some cases?
Argumentation's ethics doesn't say that you agree with non-aggression, just simply that you appeal to it and presuppose it when you argue. So it's more a case of if argumentation is occurring, this is happening.
In that case, isn't argumentation just it's just a question of practicality then, not a question of ethics? Because like if you want to be within a society, yeah, you have to not commit aggression, but that's not saying aggression is right or wrong. That's just saying aggression is that's just saying that non-aggression is needed for something. Very similar to what I was saying. That yeah, being consistent with it doesn't necessarily mean that you're affirming it as being right or wrong. So how can people who use argumentation ethics say that aggression is wrong when from what it sounds like, you're just saying non-aggression is just required to live in a society?
Well, I would say that you would need something else on top of argumentation ethics to say whether aggression is good or bad. But I think the simple case of if you want to participate in society and argumentation, you must appeal to it is a good enough reason for it. If you want to say it's a good thing to not aggress, I would recommend looking into religion.
So I guess in that case, how exactly would law and morality be different? Because law to a large degree it basically says that there's some morality that we should enforce. When you chase it all the way back, you get to a point where you say this one thing is such it's so morally bad to let's say commit murder that we're going to punish someone for committing murder. So how exactly can you separate morality from law, aside from just saying that they're completely separate and there is no right and wrong within law, and it's just a matter of practicality?
I would say ethics and law are synonymous. Ethics saying what's not, and morals saying what you ought to do. If you legislate morality as law, you'd be forcing people to do a bunch of oughts instead of ought nots.
So that's the distinction. Ethics is what you ought not to do. Morality is what you ought to do.
That is my understanding. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
To try and even it about a bit, Does anyone have any questions for JimBob by any chance? Because I actually do have some, but if anyone else has some, I'd like to let them get it up first. Oh, okay. Bem has this for a Killer Gummy Bear. I'll read it out since I did ask them to submit a question, but they're saying if argumentative ethics is true, this would establish a contradiction in actions. This would suggest a rational actor ought not to do this by the definition of rationality. However, rationality is not the same as morality. Why does the rational contradiction matter for moral purposes? For example, is it immoral to act irrationally, or is ethics only about how a rational actor ought to behave rather than morality?
I would say that
Uh,
last statement is correct. Yes, it's about how a rational actor ought to behave, rationally speaking, not about morality itself.
I would say that so I've pretty much answered this with Raid right previously, but in short, I do not believe argumentation requires rational actors. They can be self-interested or interested in others, but they do not need to be rational for argumentation to occur. And argumentation ethics is talking about ethics, what you ought not to do, rather what you ought to do.
Okay. Lego Shopping has a Let's Go Shopping has a question. I'm gonna invite him to speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, what's up?
All right, so I have a question, I guess, for both of you, and that's what is the point in arguing this, and what does your position prove? I guess, because I'm a little lost here.
I'll let Jim Bob go first, and then Gummy Bear can answer after him.
Okay. I would say by arguing, you're appealing to the idea that people ought to be rational. So if you can show that believing in certain arguments or believing in the process of argumentation or whatever says that you rationally ought to X or Y, that's valuable because that means that, yeah, rationally you ought to X or Y, and that's very relevant to how people should act and, apply that argument to anyone who does try to act rationally, and you'll change their behavior. And that's meaningful because, well, it changes their behavior. I think my version of argumentation ethics is more valuable in this exact sense because it tries to explain how, like, egoism doesn't make sense because you cannot persuasively argue for egoism without appealing to the interests of the opponent you're arguing against, and also appealing to the idea that you should appeal to the interests of your opponents in any rational interaction where you're trying to get at the truth. And you also have to appeal to truth itself by making the argument. So if you're an egoist and you try and argue in favor of egoism, you end up arguing against egoism by mistake because you end up accidentally with premises that support the conclusion that any persuasive argument or rational debate, people should act in reference to each other's interests, which is fundamentally at odds with the idea that everyone should act only in their own self-interest. So in that way, that kind of tells you something about egoism specifically, that it's inconsistent. And if you take it more strongly, it can also mean things about the NAP and how ethics should be grounded in general.
All right, if that's the end of your response,
Yeah.
Killer Gummy Bear, you can answer his question.
Okay, could he repeat the question again?
I think it was what is your point in arguing this, and what do you achieve by proving your point? I think that was it.
Okay.
Yeah.
The reason why I'm arguing this is because I believe it's to be truth and to prove a point about non-aggression. Non-aggression is a huge topic in ethics in general, and I think it would be valuable to everyone to either come to this point on their own or agree with it via argumentation. I think the NAP is required for society to function, and the lack of it leads to social degradation.
All right, that is. Let's see. I believe. Well, you already answered it, so there's no point in asking it now. Plus, I don't know if we want to keep that on recording. Anyways, I guess I'll start with my question for Jim Bob. So,
Mhm.
my first one would be: are you a foundationalist or a coherentist? Like, what is your epistemology?
I would have to look at what the definitions of those are. I'm not
Okay,
familiar with
that's yeah, that's gonna be
politics.
too complicated to get into right now. So I guess I'll just ask something else. Um, can you define rationalism? Because a lot of the people in the audience, especially on the Minecraft server, were a little confused by what you meant by rationalism because they
I
thought you
yeah,
had an idiosyncratic definition.
I mean more broadly just the appeal to reason in general. And when I say like persuasive arguments must appeal to general normative rationalism as a premise, what I mean is that a persuasive argument, in order to prove a conclusion that tells someone what they should believe, what they ought to believe, that should be like a rational ought, because the whole argument is built on premises bringing you to a rational conclusion. Regardless of how the argument is structured, you have to appeal to to reason in a general sense. You have to appeal to reason in a general sense for the argument to function. And you also have to appeal to the idea that you ought to be rational in order for you to be able to get an ought to believe X on the other end. Because if you don't believe in like if you don't appeal to the idea that you rationally ought to act, blah blah blah, or like it, if you don't appeal to if you don't appeal to the idea that you ought to act rationally, then if you make any persuasive argument, whatever conclusion is on the other end, saying you rationally ought to believe this, or you ought to believe this because all of these reasons, those conclusions can simply be ignored. The argument isn't actually persuasive. The conclusion for the opponent you're arguing with just doesn't follow. Because if neither of you agree with normative rationalism, then the argument ceases to make any sense. How can you prove that I rationally ought to believe in X? If I don't have to believe in anything, I don't ought to act some way, rationally speaking, and I don't ought to act rationally. If I don't ought to act, if it's not true that I ought to act rationally, why should I ought to believe X based on your rational argument? It just doesn't follow. So, in that sense, any persuasive argument that tries to convince people of something has to appeal to the idea that being rational is good.
Okay,
Does that
so
kind of explain?
my second question would be: are you a moral realist? And by moral realist, I mean someone that believes that morality exists objectively or extramentally, not just as like a figment of the mind or something similar.
I would probably, at this point, answer yes. I think you can construct, kind of like a constructivist would say, I would think you can form propositions and that those propositions relative to some standard can be true. And then I also think that you can construct better and better standards that apply more universally. Do I think humans have achieved this? No, probably not. But in theory, it should be possible. And in theory, I would suggest that yes, there is some standard out there that is like just the perfect standard for how sentient beings should act, like, and probably in a way that's like founded on reason, right? And so you can, if you could find or deduce such a standard, you could then say you ought to do this in this circumstance, you ought to do that in this other circumstance, and you can say these propositions as objective. And in that sense, they would function as like a universal ethical system because you're saying you ought to do this morally relative to this moral standard that is the most consistent moral standard that can be defined. If you can define a standard like that, then you're golden, and I think it probably is possible to define a standard like that. So in that kind of sense, I would consider myself a moral realist. Of course, everything I've been talking about with interests and argumentation ethics, blah blah blah, it's all based on the idea that you rationally ought to um, like not contradict the fulfillment of interest as a value. I'm basing it in rationalism. And then from there I use that to try and like explain ethics and morality. Like why shouldn't you murder? Well, it's because it's irrational, because it contradicts this principle, and that principle is just something that's like people intuitively can kind of think about, and that's why it intuitively goes against what we would normally think of as morals, even though it's technically it's founded on like rational assumptions. But do those rational assumptions exist? Yes. Can you find, like, is there some set of standards that might be the best standards? I would probably say so. And if you could find that, then yeah, you would absolutely be able to define moral propositions, or propositions that in any other context would be deemed moral, and you can define them as objectively true or objectively false based on the whatever standard you can find. So yeah, I would say the answer to your question is yes.
All right, that's fair.
A bit of a long-winded answer there, but you know, it's a little weird. I am not an absolutist, though. I don't think there are like a proposition that is true regardless of circumstance. I think like if a proposition is true or false, it's because the circumstance where it's true is baked into the proposition. So like stealing a TV from Walmart because I really want a TV, and that's it. There's no other context. Like all the other context should be irrelevant to that proposition. Your proposition is just, is it okay to steal a TV because I want a TV? The answer should be no, right? Now, to say it's wrong to steal a TV with nothing else there, suddenly you can't really give an answer because you could imagine all sorts of weird scenarios. Like what the other guy did, appealing to consequentialism, you can make all sorts of weird arguments that make these like absolute claims fall apart. You could say that to steal a TV is always like inherently frustrating, inherently violating upon the interests of whoever owns the TV. By the definition of what stealing is, you're taking something from them that they didn't agree to be taken from them. That's going to frustrate their interest, at least in most cases. And yeah, that's objectively true. And if you think that actions like that are objectively wrong, then you can say that's objectively wrong. But you know, that gets into a different conversation.
Mhm. All right,
My
so this will
overall point is that I
be.
separate, like,
Oh,
moral
go
my
ahead.
overall point is that I separate moral absolutism from moral realism. I think they're two different things.
Okay, so this will be, I guess, my last question. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. So I guess it would just be like, what is your view on normative ethics? Like, for example, would you be a utilitarian, like a consequentialist, or like would you take a deontology or like virtue ethics view? Where would you fall in terms of your normative ethics?
I suppose I suppose you could describe it as a kind of consequentialist deontology, where you have like a deontological standard. For me, it would probably be the deontological standard that the fulfillment of interests of sentient beings and all, like, in any possible reference frame. Sorry, did my mic just cut out?
No, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, good. I thought it did for a second. I would like subscribe to the deontology that the fulfillment of interests of sentient beings is a principle that you ought to follow, and that's a that's a deontological principle, and from that you can get arguments that kind of explain when consequentialism works and when it doesn't. So, for example, like stealing from someone for the greater good, right? Uh, Whether or not it results in a greater good or not, it's still stealing, and that's still an inherently frustrating action, inconsistent with the interests of the person you're stealing from. And since you're not defending the principle of fulfillment of interest by doing that, unless they're doing something that's violating other people's interests, in which case you're basically like saying that interests that violate other people's interests are irrational interests, and the fulfillment of interests only works for rational interests. So if someone has some irrational interest, you should be able to frustrate their interest, because frustrating their interest is actually consistent in a sense. But no, if this person is just has a TV, they're not frustrating anyone's interest, they're not violating anybody. And so if you steal their TV for your own interests, that's still inconsistent. So in that kind of sense, and that's a way of like arguing against consequentialist um, conclusions, because like consequentialism usually appeals to an extra thing. It appeals to like majoritarianism or something, rather than just being true in and of itself. Thinking that the fulfillment of interest is good and that the respect of interest is good doesn't mean it's not the same thing as saying we should maximize everyone's interests. Maximize? Where's that coming from? Well, it's majoritarianism. You're appealing to that. So if you don't appeal to that, then consequentialist outcomes could be true if inaction is somehow like results in such a huge catastrophe that the catastrophe happening itself and inaction towards stopping that catastrophe could be seen as inconsistent with the principle. But otherwise, no, you can't just like do something bad to someone for the greater good, because what you're still doing is still like frustrating towards their interests, so you're still violating the principle of interests. And so that's how it's kind of like a deontological principle that can also function in consequentialist ways. And there's another thing here too, because if you take your like deontological principle, fulfillment of interest good, or interest valuable, or whatever you want to call it, and then you have a situation where you get to make some choice, where choice 1 fulfills these people's interests, and choice 2 fulfills a bunch other people's interests, and your decision to make the choice, whichever choice you choose isn't inherently frustrating to anybody's interests, or your position of power here isn't brought about by inherently frustrating means, there's nothing going on here that's against people's interests, then consequentialism is suddenly a very useful tool again. You should pick the choice which maximizes the interests, blah blah blah. Since no one's having their interests directly violated in either scenario, you should just choose the better scenario, and that's the end of the thought process. So in that kind of sense, in that kind of situation where no one's actually being like sacrificed for greater good or anything like that, then consequentialism suddenly becomes a useful tool. Where in other situations it might not be. So in that sense, consequentialism is more of a tool than something I prescribe with like something I like presuppose in and of itself. So in that sense, I would be like I guess it would be based on a deontological principle in my views.
Okay. I think that might be it for tonight. If nobody has any other questions, of course, thank you for both of our debaters for showing up tonight and have making this debate possible. I would. No, I don't think anybody else has any questions. All right, I think it's fair if we close it out then.